the AI summary stuff just because. And yeah, let's get started. I'm all excited about this. Dorn, you've become like I'm just a huge fanboy. This is a book that I've been waiting for somebody to write. And I kind of feel like it's really, I mean, for me, it was very informative around agriculture, but I think the concepts are pretty broadly applicable. I think we need knowledge utilities in a whole lot of spaces in life. So I'm excited to talk about what they might be. And I also kind of I feel like we've been looking at it for 20 years or so, and we actually don't know enough about them yet. I mean, we have this idea that they can exist now, but I don't think we're very good at building them. And so I'd like to kind of poke some more at, what we need to learn so that we can be more successful on this. And so I really appreciate you kind of putting this out there as a tool. I was thinking we got enough people that maybe we won't do introductions in the round, but please put introductions in the chat, and I'll certainly save it on the GRC Slack. And if anybody wants the chat, let me know, and I can email it to you. We are doing the recording, so we'll have that as a resource as well. And if it's okay, we're just going to kick off. But I was going to ask a few questions with Dorn, and then we could have a conversation after that. But maybe we start at Dorn with just the bio. Who are you? And like, have you always been a farmer?
Yeah, well, I grew up on a family farm, and certainly, I mean, I was clearly interested in agriculture even as I, went through high school because I applied to the Cornell Ag School. But I also grew up, surrounded by sort of international development circles, a lot of folks in Peace Corps and State Department coming through, and so forth so it was an interesting family farm. So my father actually also went to Cornell but studied, he was saying felt very isolated at that time in the 60s when it was the middle of the Green Revolution, and that was the transition. And it's only actually in the course of writing this book that I really understood what was happening, sort of in some of the dynamics with FAO and some of the big powers that were really shifting the narrative around both agriculture as well as development and human, and uh, um, so I sort of look back in terms of my experience and understand there are these layers that even the professors that I was talking to as an undergrad at Cornell were at the tail edge of this. And one of the pivotal things I cover in the book is like at one point in a senior year in an upper level ag economics and rural development class, saying basically everything that the last 3 years that's off the book on the books that we're talking to you that you've been indoctrinated in, we've actually found is counterproductive, and good luck. So and we really are looking to you to think about something, another approach to this. The forces of large scale finance and scaling are not necessarily compatible, and the commodity agriculture and so forth, we're saying are having these negative externalities in so many ways, in terms of local resilience, in terms of economic and rural development, like all the different other indicators besides sort of efficiency of production, and also destabilizing economies and communities and so forth. So that was a pretty powerful sort of moment that I recalled, and so that set me on a bit of a different trajectory for a while. And I came to realize, and I chronicle a little bit in the book, a much more exciting and inspiring vision for what where Cornell was. And I don't need this intro to be all about Cornell. I just sort of I'm ending up in this place, but is that a lot of the early thinkers around the formation of the FAO in the first place, coming out of World War II and the need for reconstruction and decolonization and small scale sort of resilience of emerging economies, was around a different thinking around the role of agriculture and the land redistribution and the access to appropriate tools, the access to appropriate knowledge, the access to soils information, to rebuild and reconstruct through and with the idea that agriculture is at the foundation of of the wealth and health of a society. And that's a very old idea, but that took a few different turns in the mid 70s. But I sort of realized I was on the tail end of that, basically, in my early education, and I feel like we're cycling right now. And so my graduate work was really looking at what does it look like to, it was titled a physiocratic framework for open source research and development. So physiocrats meaning sort of the governance of nature, and those were the first land-based economists in the 1700s, to Benjamin Franklin, Dupont de Nemours, and others. Really, Jefferson and the states were really influenced by them, including Adam Smith. He has almost a whole chapter about the physiocrats and their thinking around the role of agriculture as the foundation of an economy, and that everything else is a transformation of that original wealth and how we manage that. So that was also, and then, but part of that was, again, the knowledge and how do we create and document what works and share that, because it is so both global. And so this gets to where we're talking about sort of the modern sort of manifestation of this, in terms of knowledge utilities, is how do we, from, and so how do we sort of adapt our global knowledge, but for what's uniquely local about an individual enterprise, an individual farm, an individual community? How do we share that? And so at that time, it was the creation of the encyclopedia, or sort of a practical sort of documentation of farm technology. It's like the pre-Wikipedia documentation of all agricultural industrial knowledge, as a crowd-based sort of published volume, the most published, one of the most published, books at the time. It's a whole multi-volume set, 20,000 articles, thousands of contributors, but with a printing press. So that was, again, very influential in sort of thinking about what does that look like in a modern context. There are versions throughout sort of agrarian movements in other, more recently as well, in the States, um, uh, but so that was sort of the genesis of thinking about projects like FarmHack, and again, documenting open source tools and technology, but then looking, and through that process, really thinking about, well, part of thinking more broadly that this agriculture, as we're thinking about this, is it really has these tensions between being a private enterprise, but also creating all these public goods. Not just, knowledge is sort of the one that, in terms of, that's important, but also that now that we're asking so much for agriculture in this environment of climate change, and managing public resources through improvement of soil health and water and biodiversity and air quality and carbon capture and aesthetics, like all these other values that we're asking to be created. How do we start to document and steward all that information, which are public goods, while we're also creating private enterprises that thrive and are viable and keep people on the land, and reward people for improving the quality of the soil in the community. So this is so that was sort of that was the big question, I guess, that I got into later, through my graduate work. But meanwhile, of course, I'm living on a farm and applying, like trying to apply and applying this in different ways, both from the sort of the global or community level, but also working with the agroecology and principles in our own operation in our own community. And so that was sort of the genesis, both of the of launching FarmHack, then the FarmOS software platform, and then more recently applying that to the open technology ecosystem for agricultural management project, which is now more than 70 organizations collaborating to start to create some of that ecosystem that isn't just about the technology, but the method of collaboration that's focused around the idea of agriculture as an open public science, a system science, a multi-generational accumulation of knowledge. What does that look like if you're going to build it? Looking at other open science projects like deep space exploration or Human Genome Project or the Hadron Collider. Like, how do we think about what we're doing in our land with that kind of context and that kind of scope? So that's sort of where sort of the genesis of Open Team sort of came about, and here we are. And one of the but and I guess the book was really one of the things that was a quote from the physiocrats, is that if an idea matures, it should be able to be accessible by anybody. There's a democratization of the language, and dissertations are not particularly accessible. So I can't speak for how accessible this book is, but it was my attempt to start to translate ideas into a more accessible format. And that felt like kind of a duty to continually work through ideas and in across disciplines, across communities, to socialize the idea that agriculture is something that we do together. It's multi-generational, and that it is the expression of our understanding of the environment and how we work with each other, and that we can use our available understanding, not just of the natural systems, but of technology, to understand, not just destroy, but to benefit, and that we have the opportunity to become beneficial organisms by understanding our environment better and using the tools that we have at our disposal. So that's sort of the hopeful part, is that the same tools that we've used to destroy the environment, we can use to understand it, and to, just like we can see that if we can, just as we can create conditions that are detrimental to species, we can increase the biodiversity just as much as we can decrease it. So I think and we have examples of where we can do that. So that's kind of the hopeful part, is that we have that opportunity. If we have it, we should take a best effort at using our tools and shared knowledge to do that. So that's sort of that was the motivation, was to start that conversation and that journey and reframing, and ideally, as Bucky Fuller said, make the other models obsolete in the process.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, and I kind of want to go in and unpack a little bit of the details around the actual projects you're working on and stuff now. And I was thinking maybe just to we've got, I think, few folks from a couple of different lenses kind of in this session. I know there's a few folks that are from the GRC doing thinking about regeneration. There's a few folks from collaborative tech, people who have more tech than regeneration, some more regeneration than tech probably, and so in the book title you're using the word regeneration. When did you adopt that word, and is that still the right word, kind of? How are you?
Yeah, I still am committed to it. I think there's still refinement in the definition and its use. I think often we hear things like regenerative practices, which to me is actually not a precise definition, because what I think of regeneration is it's actually the definition is quantifiable, is that the system is improved over time. And that's important, that it's measured over time, and that it can come from a degraded system into a functioning system, but a functioning system can be improved, and that continual improvement cycle is what regeneration, and measurable is important. So if you have practices, you can have practices that lead to regeneration, but they're not regenerative practices. It's actually a quantifiable environmental outcome and or social outcome. It's sort of this systems level measurement. But to me, it's important that it's that quantifiable movement over time. And it's different from, say, certifications and things that are generally like, what are the things that you didn't do or did do? It's really outcomes based in its measurement. So I think that's a pretty important part of the definition from my perspective. And also, if you it can also be defined in terms of its relationship to sustainability or degradation or extraction. So regeneration is sort of the opposite of extraction, and it's also movement beyond sustainability, which is a status quo, which could be defined at a very low level, whereas regeneration requires continual improvement. So I think that's a pretty important aspect to it, and I'm thrilled that it's being adopted more widely. I'll be honest, it's been a tension with some of the organic folks, but more, I think, from a marketing perspective than from in terms of sort of sucking oxygen away without the definition and integrity behind it yet. But I feel it's a much stronger overall term if we can move in towards a tight definition.
Well, and it's funny to hear you talking about the realization in college of like the current strategy isn't working. And I've been thinking back over my father was a researcher for the USDA. He's got a PhD from the University of Iowa State, and he was in looking backwards, I can see that the research he was doing was to help reinforce industrial farming techniques. It's like how do you raise more chickens in the same building kinds of questions. And it's like, oh, that's what was going on, kind of. And there was, I think, kind of clearly policy that was driving towards industrial farming approaches. What it's like how can you what's the right question here, I guess, is like can we maybe the question should be like, and you've been working in Malawi too, right? Can you talk to us about the work you've been doing overseas a little bit, just to give us context?
Yeah, well, not me individually, but a lot of the folks that we work with, and that's kind of that is actually the story, is that if we have this shared knowledge commons, it allows the work to be built on, with this concept of FAIR principles: findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And so what that means is some of the tools and software that we developed in one part of the United States can be adapted and reused anywhere on Earth, and that's part of the, but that's not an accident. That's actually built into the way it's been designed to be able to be reusable, interoperable, and so I guess that's sort of and the the stories of the extension folks and on-farm research that network in Malawi is really sort of a testament to that. And that's that even as we're working geographically different, there's parts of what we're doing that that is universal, and our understanding of the way soils work, the way we describe field methods, the way we describe the individual practices, so that we can compare results of operations, the way legumes and grasses interact, the way fungal networks work. Those are all universal, but your community cultural context, the local economics, the manufacturing capacity for or accessibility to tools, those are all unique, local, and the rest of the social contexts are really unique. So I think that's some of those are some of the challenges that we're working, not just in Malawi, but like looking at with a lot of interactions with in Southeast Asia and the Indian context, and in South America, and seeing, again, this is sort of this universal sort of challenge. And honestly is like speaks to precisely what the original FAO was intended to do, and I'm not sure really is to create those catalogs of those universal skills and tools and so forth. And I feel like we're in the process of trying to recreate that from this international resource that can be adapted to local languages and contexts. And also not only adapted, it's not just a push, it's a pull. It's a sort of this process of gathering and updating, continual improvement of our knowledge as well. So it's really part of a collaborative, massive, collaborative science or project. Participatory research is sort of the academic term, but and participatory mapping too is sort of the other aspect of that. So that's an example just in Malawi, but this is part of what we're actively engaged in, and actually in the process. I'm just going to keep going here for a second, but one of the things that we're looking at now is, we're with the open technology ecosystem for agricultural management, is recognizing that even as we are participating in this global effort, we are we're coming at this from an English language perspective in a North American, generally time zones. And so even though we're communities of practice, we're really rooted in our own cultural contexts. And so we're also looking at, say, there are similar on the ground extension organizations and citizen science networks in Malawi or in India or in Eastern Europe that are doing similar things. So the question is, how do we engage with them effectively, and at what level, while we're, and again, this is really important, I think, building this global knowledge while we're actually creating autonomy, because our point of coming together is actually to create more autonomy and agency individually and in our own community. So data sovereignty, food sovereignty, or sort of the other side of sort of open knowledge sharing isn't that we share everything. It's actually we do this voluntarily to increase agency. And how do we come together to create both of those, those things together? And I think that applies to more than agriculture. But I think we're seeing it in real time, that tension. And so it requires, and it pretty quickly gets into how do we create better governance structures, and how can we use the tools of communication to increase that autonomy and protect our identity while we're also sharing those things that most of what we collect is more valuable when we do share it, but we have to do it in a way that's really, that again is not coerced and is actually gives us more agency rather than less. So I think those are some of the things that we're getting into. So it really, that's not really a great answer to your Malawi question, but that's where that leads as we get into those conversations, is the creating solidarity, but autonomy, mutually dependent independence. And so that's sort of how I see the extension groups that are doing thousands of independent farmers using the same software but making it their own. To me, that's sort of the expression as a case study of how that can and should work.
I know that I've got a few kind of things that I look at that were inspiring around me for why I'm so excited about open source. And one of them is the Linux operating system, and Linux battling IBM for dominance kind of back in the, I don't know, 20 years ago. Well, do you have aha kind of like things that like made you think that the open source strategy was viable?
Oh, yeah, many, many times. And I sort of really, I mean, and I continually have them, I think, is like the pace of, the accelerated pace and access to others' knowledge. Again, so many of these challenges are too complex to tackle any one organization, any one individual. And I feel like it's almost, I mean, that's sort of one of the motivations is to be able to tackle a really hard problem and realize somebody else has worked on it, and that we can give attribution and go further faster. So that's like a daily occurrence. But I wrote, there are two that I think I put in the book. One was on our own farm, I got really interested in doing on-farm biofuel production, and there's a woman who was building home biodiesel processing plant setups that you could build, with mostly resources in your big box store or hardware store, but there's industrial technology built into the process, so sophisticated knowledge that rather than selling it, sort of she was publishing those plans and making them free and holding workshops around the country to help folks build them. And that to me was a remarkable sort of illustration without really even the sophistication of Creative Commons licenses or anything. It was just out there doing it. And that was an aha moment, saying, whoa, and then watching over the course of a few workshops that I attended and hosted, how the designs got better fast, because nobody was there saying, the assumption in that moment was, I'm going to monetize this and put a wrapper around it, and then I'm going to make a business. It's like the motivation was, how do we make better tools? And then by sharing them with others, I can get a better tool faster, because this is hard stuff and it's really complex and we need others to help figure it out. So that was a pretty a big motivation. But then I ran in, and so that was part of pre-generation prior to founding Farmac. It was sort of that same idea, and then recognizing, oh, this is a really old idea. Like it's only recently that we have even the patent office isn't supposed to function the way it is. So it sort of that was a spark to sort of look a little bit more deeply and say, wait a minute, our management of these systems is really slowing us down, and we have some big problems that might be not that. And again, I'm not, there's venture funding is good for some things, but when we're trying to solve these systematic problems, it may not be the best way to actually come up with a larger collaborative, bigger solution that scales. So that was a pretty big moment. And then right about the time of FarmHack, a lot of internet forums were really starting to take off to make that process easier. So we were saying, well, how do we use sort of the wiki format, which is sort of the modern form of that collaborative encyclopedia concept, to start to create a structure for better documentation of hardware and software together. And this is a little pre-GitLab and all that stuff too. But really thinking through how do we create attribution and share. And then I also wrote in the book about public laboratory, which was hacking low-cost digital cameras that were just on the market and putting them on balloons, and then using open source, both open source software for creating better firmware to create intervalometers, or so you could take just camera lots of images and create software to stitch them together. And then you have super high resolution, like better than most satellite imagery at very, very low cost, made possible because we're sharing some of this basic code and the hardware designs for how to do that. So that was a pretty aha moment. It's like, wait a minute, I can get like the kind of imagery that only nation states or large corporations were generating previously, and put that in the hands of anybody. That was a pretty powerful moment too. And what's the social organization that made that possible? So that was a pretty pivotal moment. And I feel like we're still on that trajectory, saying, answering that question: how do we organize and create more of that in a way that that sort of snowballs?
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of feel like that's the piece that we really need to study. Is it's one thing to open something up, and I think you talk about it a little bit in the book, that releasing content is one thing, but having that content get better is really the problem. And so I think we often think of the commons as in we need to preserve the commons because we're thinking about land, I think. But certainly in the intellectual space, we need it to get better. And there's a
That
dynamic
continual
in it.
improvement and all of it. Yeah, that's a really key concept, I think. And again, I think that's been an evolution in the open source on the software world too. As I think you were just saying, basically that it went from here, I'm just going to put this out and you can do with it what you want, to we're actually designing it now so that it's easier for others to build on. That takes a whole different mindset and structure. And a different level of documentation. There's a whole different organizational structure that goes with that, I think. So and again, we're trying to apply it not just to software, but how do we apply this to like all sorts of knowledge and work that we're applying. But I'll just note one other thing that I kind of realized was like software is kind of our best language for describing complex systems, and that includes hardware. Like even hardware descriptions can be distilled down into instructions, or the blueprints can be distilled down for building something, can be distilled down into this description of how things work. So that was kind of a universal language. So that was kind of even though I'm not actually a software developer directly, that was a big part of my sort of a pretty big revelation, I guess, as we're trying to document and think about how we describe the world and how the systems work or don't work.
I see Turquoise has already got a question in the chat. I'm gonna ask one more question, and then maybe we can have more have a conversational format. And that's you used the term the good Anthropocene or Anthropocene. I don't even know how you say that word.
Yeah.
And I've resonated with that. That was something I thought about a little bit. But I was just like, what's that look like to you, and what's the importance of that term?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's meant to be a little provocative, because it is the assumption that our presence is detrimental, and there's certainly the case to have been made in terms of mass extinction events and so forth, and climate change and so forth. but to make the case that if we have shown areas where we have done the reverse and we've created regeneration as a species, that it is possible. And if it is possible, that we can extend and identify what were the conditions that made that possible, which allows for massive change quickly. And certainly we're seeing the need for that. So I guess having a vision for what that looks like and what the potential is for that, I think is an important possibility to hold out as a vision. And so again, that comes into the title of hope, right? So I think that's, and I guess it comes down to like it's a sort of that I think the Jonathan Smith quote, and I'm not going to get it right without looking at it, but just like if where you can grow two blades of grass where there was one before, that is of more value than all the lawyers and business people and so forth. So the basic idea of that if we can do that, we should do that, and that process of continual improvement can be culturally adapted, and the reciprocity and engagement in nature is possible. And again, just to give an example, and I didn't go a great deal of depth, but books like Braiding Sweetgrass go in depth with this idea of reciprocity and engagement and stewardship and improvement. So I think there are examples over thousands of years of regeneration and stewardship that of indigenous populations. And so how do we in our current moment be inspired by what's that vision, while we acknowledge the tools and technologies we have now, but how do we repurpose them for that good Anthropocene, like using satellite, or satellite imagery or sensor technology. Like we can experience either spiritually and culturally, we can make those changes in understanding the value of plants and fungal populations and ruminants on the livestock, on the landscape. And we also have a whole culture now with tools to describe them in detail, down to the good Anthropocene means like understanding the use of mRNA technology for benefit, or like what are the really, and being skeptical but also embracing what's possible. And I think there's a quote in there like, we're the species that can both make the species extinct and then bring them back, right? Like we're so not that, again, that's the first condition isn't what we want to desire, but the fact that we have this possibility is what we're trying to really engage in. And so how do we culturally engage with that and make decisions to move in that direction?
It does. Yeah, I've kind of ended up thinking it's like we had like an accidental Anthropocene. We kind of didn't really acknowledge that we had this power,
It wasn't
and
conscious. Yeah.
and now we need a deliberate one or an intentional one or something like that. And there is the realization that's critical, but
Yeah, well, and there's
it's
sort of
a
that, there's the case that this good Anthropocene is part of that consciousness, that human consciousness that's connected globally now for the that wasn't. It's like, I think that's kind of the thing, and we've just been behind the curve in understanding the destruction, developing the tools to understand destruction on the wrong side of it. It's already happened. So I think the good Anthropocene is like, can we forecast, can we flip that around so we can project and avoid and improve?
use our powers for good.
Yeah.
Well, hey, let me Turquoise, you had a question in chat. Do you want to just ask it here? Turquoise, have we still got you? Are you muted?
Yeah, there's a comment, when you know better, you do better, or yeah, like if you can comprehend, you can improve, maybe. Yeah.
Well, anybody else questions or thoughts, reactions?
I'll just jump in when you can comprehend, you can improve. I just want to point to the importance that I'm seeing about in functional leadership about permeability, right? Like that willingness to be like, oh, I didn't know as much as I could have, or oh, it like there's this thing wrapped up with shame, right? Like I didn't know, therefore it's shameful. And I think until we get past that, there's going to be this resistance to growth and transformation. I just wanted to throw that in. I'm Martin.
Yeah, and
Nice to meet you, by the
I
way.
think
Really
that's
great
really,
work.
Yeah, no, I really like that. And I think that was something that I was trying to get at too, is that science isn't also, science is sort of that mind frame of curiosity and engagement. It's something that we all do in terms of how we explain the way the world works. And I think the professionalization of science has taken a lot of that away in some ways, and it's the realm of experts and specialists, and so it's been very deductive, and there's so much that we don't know, and that's the huge part of science from my perspective, is the inductive and the observational. And that's where I think of some of the other public sciences like deep space exploration, where you don't, or deep ocean exploration, or the edges of it. And I really think that agriculture and understanding most of nature is actually, there's always that component that we don't know, and we don't understand all the interactions, and that observational science is legitimate and important. And everything, you don't start with a hypothesis necessarily, that there's this other part that requires sort of a systems understanding and dynamics that are at play. So I think that's and then I think it's important that the science is also not something we do individually, but something that is part of our public discourse and conversation. Because I think that's also part of that shame you're talking about, is like that it's really important from my perspective that that it's that curiosity and engagement is actually the first is sort of the first thing that's most important. And that it fills a really deep human role, that if that is otherwise, it's not that spirituality isn't also important, but it also fills that human need, I think, for helping to explain the way the world works.
So Turquoise did just say that she can't unmic right now, but her question was, what if any risks or potential harms can come from open sourcing these technologies? What kind of downsides do you see here?
No, I think that's fantastic, because the technology by themselves, technology is not neutral. I know, just from my perspective, it's a product of technology is a byproduct of the cultures that create it and the systems that support it. And so and you can just pick any sort of destructive technology, like in terms of that, as an example, for a nuclear power plant versus a citizen, like, or a balloon with a camera to monitor wildlife, or so these are so there clearly are dangers, and I think the other distinction to make is that besides sort of the cultural context and what is supported and what's elevated and created, is also that the difference between the technology or the blueprints to build something, and then the data associated with it, and that distinction between open access to data, because we've certainly entered into issues of sensitivity around sort of mapping of archaeological sites can be really damaging. Mapping of endangered species in coastal areas of particular kinds of seaweeds. Like, there are things that can have really, where knowledge made too accessible has unintended consequences. So I think the regional or local sort of autonomy, solid, let's see, the having sovereignty, data sovereignty and food sovereignty as the foundation, and then local stewardship of a lot of both tools and technology, but also the knowledge related to it, is really important, and decide what is then made part of the knowledge commons, or the knowledge commonwealth. So I think that's a pretty important sort of those governance of how knowledge and data is shared and aggregated is deeply important. And
I think Kent, you started to raise your hand, maybe.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Dorn. Hi, David. It's great to see you again. So I just picked up your book, and I admit I have not done with it yet. But one of the things that struck me was that there's a lot of discussion of technology in the book, and there's even a brief history of agricultural technology. I'm a technologist by trade. I've been a technology entrepreneur for decades. And I keep running into this narrative that somehow technology is bad or not part of the solution. And I cannot reconcile that, because farming is technology, right?
Yeah.
So I struggle with this a little bit. And I was just curious, in your research for this book and your experience and that you've had, I'm sure you've encountered that as well. And how have you managed that? And because I want to find ways to apply my capabilities with technology to regenerative systems. And that is what I'm working on, researching, reaching for, and would appreciate any advice. And
Yeah, I think that's right. That's precisely what the sort of social structures and governance structures that we're working towards, that, have a foundation in open source, but are sort of, we're looking at maybe, what is the regenerative structure of governance for managing the knowledge commonwealth, and that technology can help us with that, but is also that, again, the technology is a product of the system that creates it. So how do you create a better system that creates better technology that is actually, rather than autonomous technology, we have technology autonomy, right? There's sort of that little phrase that we've been working with a bit. But that's really, so that, again, we are, rather than just to put it bluntly, computers controlling us, we're the ones in charge. We have the tiller in hand.
sure.
So that's a pretty important sort of social structure that doesn't happen by accident. Like, I think we're at where we are without a lot of intention, and we are being wagged by a lot of the tools, but it doesn't have to be that way. That's kind of the point that we try to, and we have examples of where, particularly with the sort of, I think they're not fully realized, but some of the foundational governance structures of the internet are examples of a governance that is that has been effective and can certainly go further in terms of the standards and standards bodies. These other non-governmental, non-nation state governing bodies, I think, is a pretty important aspect. And so I'll just mention here, it wasn't in the book. I talked a lot about sort of the knowledge utility concept. The concept of a utility was sort of managing a public good, and sort of the agricultural knowledge commons. But just in the last, several months, come to realize that there's a governing structure for the commons that's existed, from the Magna Carta. The Charter for the Forests was an example that held, sort of created social contracts for the public benefit that needed to be ratified regularly. And I feel like there's an example for a governing structure that, again, has been that can be renewed. So I'm really excited about creating a new charter for agricultural knowledge commons, under which organizations and tools and technologies can be chartered and organized, so that there's both autonomy, but we can start to relate our projects regionally with one another in a meaningful way, and share, I think, not just the technology interoperability, but the social goals, the social contracts that we're agreeing to. Just like we have a Hippocratic oath, how do we create these other oaths of care related to our professions that keep us aligned, and hold each other accountable, and can be contracted, and and create appropriate governing bodies. Not because we have right now we have this sort of this thing with civil society and NGOs. They're distinctly non-governance government organizations. But what we're actually talking about is governance organizations, creating new entities where we voluntarily hold ourselves accountable to decision-making processes and values. So that's something I think that is sort of exactly what your question is, like, spot on, I think, in terms of it's in order to create and contribute to technology that will be beneficial.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Well, and maybe we'll go, it's really easy almost to fall back into this, to the rules that we've always had, right? I mean, there's a reason we have copyright and patent and all these kinds of things, right? We're just re-exploring these concepts, I think. And so we're going to have to figure out new ways to do these things, I think,
Right. It's not that no governance, it's good governance, right, is the solution. And sort of the other David Graeber quote is like anything that has been made can be remade. So like I think that's pretty important. So many of these assumptions that you think are like so, are sort of are like foundational or just relatively young, in their maturity cycle. So we really do, I think that's part of the liberating thing, to look just a little further back and say, well, 50 years ago, none of these assumptions existed. And
These things were impossible.
were
Yeah.
impossible. So
Something you mentioned that was interesting was the looking toward sort of the history of the internet. So, we have the domain name service, DNS, is a fascinating example, but it's highly centralized. And people don't often realize this, that there are like 7, there's,
yeah,
and they're controlled pretty much by one small, very small, relatively speaking, given that it affects the entirety of humanity, 5.5 billion people online. And only recently, with the advent of technologies in blockchain and cryptography and in a variety of ways, have we begun to see the beginnings of a decentralization of that really core
exactly.
fundamental technology of the internet. And so I find also that there's this fear of centralization that can accompany, and your points about governance are well noted, because I've done a deep dive of, and many implementations, by the way, of holocratic or sociocratic structures for governance in a relatively decentralized manner. But if you look close, what they do is they protocol the centralization. And that's the magic of what they did in the early days of the internet.
Right.
Protocol first. See,
but versioning, like there's a process by which you centralize, but then also have a method for versioning and updates with decentralized input. And
that's right.
I think the other piece is, again, that central, the social contracts of those and those central power are enforceable. And so I took inspiration again with, and I've got to do my own academic research, but more in this. But essentially, the Magna Carta was to hold the sovereign accountable to the people as they sort of kept the fiefdoms from destroying the commons. But it was it was similar tensions, but it was a social contract with a sovereign to protect the commons of everybody else. And to me, I feel like that's what we're not as an individual sovereign, but sovereign rights and sovereign oaths to me is a pretty important concept at this moment. And that their role is to decentralize power, and to so even as we're centralizing, there are things like you're saying, those protocols where we need to agree on things in order to communicate and do big things together. Yeah. But we can take a sovereign oath to, while we're doing that, to protect the decentralization of power and knowledge. So I think that's sort of a key aspect. And like you said, there are examples, and I think that's where I sort of call on communities like this to help with a better sort of the academic foundation and understanding of what are those examples that have worked, where are they, what are the case studies, and what are the tools we have in order to make that process accessible. Because one of the big things is that for the other part of sort of the social justice aspect of this is that governance is a skill and takes time and requires resources. And we need people. It can't just reside in, this is an issue with the blockchain communities. It's entirely inaccessible to the vast majority of people, even if it has the wonderful tools to tackle some of these things. So how do we do this? How do we create these systems that actually are responsive to the people that could benefit by them?
Well, unfortunately, my own experience has been that something like 9 out of 10 people who should be paying attention to these protocols and opening their minds to these things are really closed off and don't really want to change from the way that they are. And on the crypto side, I've been running a public blockchain since 2018 that we're in the process of migrating to another blockchain, the tokens for another blockchain, and a whole bunch of stuff been into Bitcoin since 2012. I have self-promotional, but I've got a video coming out in a month that's about something really new that just happened on Bitcoin that I'm super, super excited about. But there's so much knowledge and wisdom in there, but you're right. It's super hard to connect the dots. And I've I'm trying to, that's what I'm trying to figure out too. So yeah, I love it. Great stuff. Thank you.
Well, and I love the example of DNS, Ken. I mean, because like, it's like I think people don't understand how how kind of magical some of these things have been. I mean, like, you assume the internet works, but it's still a little bit of amazing that it does. And, things like the story where John Postal, he had the DNS server under his desk at one point,
Yeah.
and he had pissed off at some decision that had been made. He like unplugged it. Um, I mean, these kinds of things happened back in the day on the internet. Like, we can't really imagine them happening now, but something else will happen, right? I mean, we don't reach stasis. We're always having to learn and adjust and adapt. You're always going to be, attacked in some sense, and there's going to have to be change, and that's part of life.
And I think one of the key things is when you describe the way that something like the internet functions is that it is not one thing. It's not even a single system that you can describe. And one really important thing is that it doesn't have a business model. The internet is not a business model. There are lots of business models that have been built on it, but it is not fundamentally a business. And that's really important because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about how do we create something as humans that it can't be described that way. And so I think we need better language and better terms in order to socialize that idea. Even though we use it every day, we understand it intuitively. We understand reciprocity every day. We understand the gift economy, but we don't have everything is, in terms of our terms on this is really focused around transactional, which is really fine. And transactions are one mode of exchange, but not the only. And I think that's a really important part also of the open source economy is that we derive value from lots of things. We derive value intrinsically in reciprocity, in gifts, in sharing, and in all these other ways that also I think give us a much more rich way of describing what we're already doing on a daily basis, but just not necessarily having the language to describe it or value it appropriately, and recognize we can build complex global structures based on those other modes of exchange. So
we've got just a couple minutes left. I have like 16 more questions. But anybody else wanted to step in? Yeah, Marna.
I'm seeing some stuff in the chat. What impact do you hope the book will have? Who's your main audience that you wrote it for? Say more about non-governmental governing bodies, please. And what are the accountability functions? And then
in 3 minutes.
In 3 minutes. And then my question is, how can we follow up with you? Because obviously there's a lot of interest and curiosity. Are you open to conversations beyond here and
totally
now?
open.
And how do we do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And anybody, and part of, if you're interested in engaging in our work streams that are testing these concepts, including, we're looking at a lot of these governance structures within Open Team and the process of exit to community for a governance structure. There's a whole academic sort of angle there that I would love to follow up with you on. So anybody who's interested, please look me up. I would love to have you, engaged with where we're trying to put these in practice in the field, because this is not none of this is about academic. This is about applied research. This is about learning by doing in the field. So if you're interested, if you have working groups or community forums or that you're actively working on, love to hear about them, identify how we can work. And
I've looked you up and I didn't see any obvious email as such. Is there a specific
Dorn
address that you'd like us to follow up with you at?
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you.
I'll do just a little plug for anybody that's not actually involved. So there will be kind of ongoing email traffic, at least around the NSF open source ecosystem grants that are due again in September of this year. I'm trying to recruit people to do regeneration grants in this area. And I think it'll be an opportunity for some of these conversations as well. Kent, you played a little bit last year. Are you going to play again this year?
I just finished my first draft for my September. I'm way ahead this time. Last year I was like 2 months. I'm like, oh my God. But I took last year as a wonderful learning experience and what not to do. and now I think I've got something a lot more dialed in this year, and I'm playing with that right now. I'm in that early stage.
Oh, fantastic. Steve, did you guys ever hear back from NSF?
Sorry, I had to find the unmute. Yes, we got a no, a regretful no a week or so ago.
You did a
I'm
week
sorry to
ago.
hear that,
Okay.
Steve. But I'll just note that Steve's on that planning committee for the next phase of the governance and secretariat for Open Team. So I think I'm excited about hopefully having some drafts, documents and oaths of care and things like that to review. Actually, before we go, let me just put in some of our draft social contracts for everybody. I know we're at time, but
Well, and Dorn, I would say we couldn't get you guys last year, but I think Open Team is actually pretty well positioned for this NSF money. And the governance question is really what they're after. So
fantastic. So Open Team data use agreements coming in the chat in 2 seconds, and then I will let you sign us off.
I also want to point out that we have a governance weekly-ish meeting here together. And Dorn, if you're not already active in the ecosystem of GRC, I hope that we can lure you.
Would love it.
funny how this stuff crosses between the governance and economics, and you can't really separate them out. So it's fascinating. Hey, thanks everybody for coming. Dorn, thank you so much. And like I said, thank you so much for the book. I really feel like that's a contribution to it's really something that people can understand, and it captures a lot of really important issues that we didn't even get to today. So
Well, I hope it's just the first of many, then others can build on it. And I've you write them and it's ready for a new edition with all the so but really thank you so much. I really appreciate the time.
Great to see everybody. I'll post everything to the GRC Slack, and if you're not on GRC, let me know. I can send things to you. So great to see you. Thanks so much.
Great. Take care. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dave.
Hey, thanks, Turquoise.
Yeah, lovely.